Begin at the Harriet Tubman mural on Germantown Avenue, where the story of freedom is placed at street level. A mural is not a museum label or a textbook chapter. It shares a wall with traffic, storefronts, buses, neighbors, and daily errands. That changes the way history is encountered. Harriet Tubman is often presented as a lone heroic figure, but her life was shaped by networks, family, faith, black communities, abolitionists, safe houses, intelligence, transportation, and the decisions of freedom seekers themselves. Tubman escaped slavery in Maryland and returned repeatedly to help others reach freedom. During the Civil War, she also served the Union as a nurse, scout, spy, and military strategist. The Philadelphia connection is not that Tubman lived here permanently, it is that Philadelphia was a major destination and organizing center for black freedom work. A city with a large free black population, abolitionist organizations, churches, publishers, and vigilance committee networks offered both support and danger. Freedom seekers arriving in Philadelphia were not automatically safe, especially after federal fugitive slave laws empowered slave catchers in free states. Use the mural as an invitation to think about movement and recognition. What does it mean for a neighborhood to place Tubman's face where thousands of people can see it without paying admission? What does the image emphasize: courage, strategy, faith, community, or forward motion? If the site's augmented reality layer includes coded signals or story cards, treat them as an interpretive game built on a serious history, not as proof that the Underground Railroad operated through one universal secret code. Historical networks were local, improvised, and dangerous. Your first foundation is public memory, a community choosing to keep black freedom history visible in the path of ordinary life. Next, step toward Fair Hill Burial Ground, where the route follows that freedom struggle into the landscape of Quaker abolition, burial, and remembrance. At Fair Hill Burial Ground, history is held in earth, stone, records, and the work of care. The site is associated with the neighboring Quaker meeting house dating to 1703, and historic Fair Hill describes the burial ground as a place where graves follow a simple Quaker tradition. Stones are similar in shape and size, reflecting a belief in the equality of people before God. That visual equality is powerful, but it should not make us imagine that everyone lived equally. The people buried here include abolitionists, women's rights activists, reformers, physicians, and community leaders whose work challenged the inequalities of their own time. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker abolitionist, women's rights activist, and social reformer. Robert Purvis, a black abolitionist and major figure in Philadelphia's anti-slavery movement, is also buried here with Harriet Purvis. A burial ground therefore becomes more than a list of names. It can be a map of relationships, religious conviction becoming organized abolition, personal mourning becoming public reform, and local neighbors becoming part of national movements. Move respectfully. Do not walk across grave markers, disturb objects, or treat the site as a backdrop for casual entertainment. Look for the way the burial ground sits within an urban neighborhood. A place of memory is not separate from public life, it survives because people maintain it, interpret it, fund it, and teach visitors how to behave within it. This stop also helps us correct the romantic language often used around the Underground Railroad. Freedom work involved risk, planning, money, shelter, transportation, record keeping, and the possibility of betrayal. It was not a simple line from slavery to safety. The people remembered here supported a longer campaign against slavery and racial injustice. Your clue is to connect Fair Hill's early Quaker setting, the equality of its stones, and the biographies of Mott and Purvis. The foundation of freedom was not one heroic act. It was a sustained network of beliefs, people, and places. From here, the route moves to Belmont Mansion, where preservation meets the complicated history of an elite estate and Underground Railroad interpretation. Belmont Mansion asks you to read an elegant estate without letting elegance erase labor, race, or power. The current mansion was built in phases from 1850 to 1860, and the Belmont site now houses an Underground Railroad museum. Its setting in Fairmount Park makes the contrast especially visible. A preserved house and landscape can look timeless, but every historic property was built, maintained, and interpreted by people living inside specific systems. Belmont's Underground Railroad interpretation presents the estate as a place connected to freedom-seeking and abolitionist history. At the same time, the site's broader history includes elite ownership, domestic labor, and the wealth that made an estate possible. Those stories belong together. A mansion should not be used to create a fantasy of benevolent rescue in which white property owners are the only actors. Freedom seekers made the most dangerous decisions themselves. Black Philadelphians built mutual aid networks and gathered intelligence. Abolitionists, religious communities, and residents provided shelter, money, transportation, and information. The phrase Underground Railroad describes a network, not a literal railway, and not a single organized institution with one command center. At Belmont, ask what evidence supports a particular story and what is an interpretation developed through museum work. Read labels, listen for uncertainty, and distinguish a documented connection from a legend repeated because it sounds dramatic. Then look at the house as a material object. Kitchens, service spaces, stairs, gardens, and entrances can tell us about the labor hidden by a polished public room. The Roots Foundation theme is becoming clearer. Freedom history is often preserved inside landscapes shaped by unequal power. Preservation is most valuable when it expands the story rather than polishing it. Your clue is to connect Belmont's Underground Railroad Museum, its mid-19th century construction, and the question of who made the estate function. Next, travel to Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion, where the focus shifts from an elite estate to Victorian middle-class daily life and the social networks around it. Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion is Philadelphia's museum of 19th-century daily life. The house interprets the world of the rising middle class from the 1860s into the early 20th century, including the people who lived upstairs and downstairs, the gardens around the house, and the transformations brought by industrialization and social change. That makes this a useful stop in a route about foundations. Freedom movements do not exist outside ordinary life. They depend on homes, workplaces, churches, businesses, newspapers, schools, and the relationships people build while carrying out daily responsibilities. Look at the mansion as a domestic system rather than a decorative shell. Who had private rooms? Who cooked, cleaned, carried, repaired, and served? What forms of labor disappear when a restored room is presented as a finished image? Historic house museums can answer those questions only when they preserve or reconstruct the lives of workers, servants, tenants, neighbors, and people whose names may not appear in the estate's most prominent records. The Maxwell Mansion's stated mission is to educate visitors about Victorian-era Philadelphia through architecture, collections, gardens, tours, theater, and lectures. Notice how interpretation uses more than dates. Furniture, wallpaper, windows, kitchen arrangements, clothing, and patterns of movement can all become evidence. This stop is also a reminder that abolitionist networks were not made only of famous speeches. The 19th century city was held together by people who shared information, made introductions, offered temporary shelter, raised funds, published arguments, and created social spaces where reform could be discussed. Do not claim that every house on an abolition route was a station. Instead, use the mansion to understand the social infrastructure around documented sites. The foundation here is the ordinary, domestic labor, neighborhood knowledge, and the material conditions that allow political work to continue. Your clue is to identify one feature that shows middle-class aspiration and one that reveals the labor required to sustain it. Then continue along Germantown Avenue to Johnson House, where a preserved home has a documented relationship to abolition and the Underground Railroad. At Johnson House, the word house does more work. Built in 1768, this Germantown home belonged to generations of the Quaker Johnson family, who were vocal abolitionists. The Johnson House historic site identifies it as a rare surviving Underground Railroad station and a place where black and white, free and enslaved people participated in the long work of seeking and supporting freedom. That history must be told carefully. The Underground Railroad was clandestine because federal and state law protected slaveholders' claims over people who escaped. A safe house was not a quaint hiding place. It was a location where a freedom seeker might be sheltered, fed, treated for injury, given information, and moved onward while slave catchers searched for them. The house's attic and interior spaces have become part of public interpretation, but visitors should resist the temptation to turn them into a treasure hunt. The most important evidence is not a cinematic tunnel. It is the network of people and choices that made the house useful: the Johnson family, neighboring abolitionists, black communities, religious convictions, money, food, communication, and the courage of the people who fled slavery. The site also carries earlier layers. The house witnessed the Revolutionary-era Battle of Germantown, and its surviving fabric includes damage associated with that conflict. A building can therefore hold multiple struggles at once: war for national independence, resistance to slavery, and the continuing work of civil rights. Johnson House's mission links preservation with present-day social advocacy. That is a powerful choice because it refuses to trap the past behind glass. A visitor is asked not merely to admire abolitionists but to consider what ordinary people can do when laws are unjust. As you stand here, look at the doors, shutters, attic, street, and neighboring homes. Freedom was built through proximity and trust. Your clue is to name the 1768 house, the Quaker Johnson family, and the documented Underground Railroad connection without turning the story into myth. From here, continue to Clifton, where the route confronts a different kind of foundation, a Georgian estate whose history includes revolution, wealth derived from slavery, and newer efforts to interpret the people who were enslaved there. End at Clifton, a Georgian country house completed in 1767 for attorney Benjamin Chew and occupied by 7 generations of the Chew family. Clifton is famous for the Battle of Germantown, fought around the house in 1777, but its current interpretation is widening beyond military history and architecture. Clifton's own research acknowledges a more complicated story involving the people enslaved by and serving the Chew family. That expansion is essential to a route about foundations. The American language of liberty was built alongside slavery, and elite houses often depended on the labor and wealth created by that system. Look at the walls and landscape as evidence of power, but do not let the buildings speak alone. Ask who lived here by choice, who lived here under coercion, who maintained the grounds, who cooked and cleaned, and whose work allowed the estate to project refinement. The route's local clue identifies Clifton with Underground Railroad interpretation, but the strongest documented connections in this immediate Germantown landscape should be kept distinct from one another. Johnson House is a documented Underground Railroad station. Clifton is a site where the National Trust and local historians are bringing enslaved people's lives into an older revolutionary and architectural narrative. Those are related histories, but not interchangeable claims. Clifton also helps us understand how preservation changes. The estate was acquired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 1972 and is now used for education, community conversations, and public interpretation about race, class, gender, civics, and freedom. A historic site is not finished when its walls are stabilized. It is unfinished until the stories attached to those walls are made more complete. Review the route's foundations: Tubman in Public Art, Fair Hills Quaker Burial Ground and Abolitionist Memory, Belmont's Underground Railroad Museum inside an elite estate, Maxwell's Domestic World, Johnson House's documented shelter network, and Clifton's effort to interpret enslavement alongside revolution. The final lesson is not that Philadelphia has a simple freedom story. It is that freedom was built by black activists, freedom seekers, abolitionists, religious communities, workers, neighbors, archivists, and present-day interpreters who keep widening the record.